appeared. And so he dismisses the scribes and the Pharisees. He's dealing now privately with just the wise men. He's inquisitive. He's asking questions. Verse 8, he says, "And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search diligently for the young child. And when you have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also.'" Now we know later on, if you read through the rest of the book of Matthew chapter 2, you find out that he didn't want to worship the child, that he wanted the child dead that was there. And so he was lying and covering this up. We also find here in verse 9, it says, "And when they heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star, which they saw in the east, went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy." A couple of things we've seen there mentioned twice, the young child. We saw it in verse 8, that diligently for the young child. We saw it again in verse 9, when they came and stood over where the young child was, and they rejoiced greatly in that. And verse 11 says, "And when they were come into the house. Now, they said they saw the young child." There's the third time it's mentioned a young child, "with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh." Now, when you see that, four times it mentions the young child. Jesus is no longer a baby. In order to travel 800 or 900 miles, what's happening is probably, and we also see here in verse 11, that where was Jesus born? He was born in a stable, right? All of every nativity scene that you've ever seen always has the wise men right there at the nativity, right? But that's not what Scripture says. And they're tying, Matthew chapter 2 is the Christmas story, but what it plants into our mind is that the wise men came and found Jesus in the stable. But Scripture says they found him in a house. And they found him not as a babe, but as a young child. So the babe changes to a young child. And so it was probably months and even up to probably a year and a half to 2 years. We know that Herod said that all of the male children under the age of 2 would be killed. And so we have that 2 years of being a boundary. But I imagine he probably put about 6 months or so of a cushion just in case, because if you remember previously, what did he say? "Tell me when this star appeared." He was trying to nail down the exact date of the birth, but they didn't tell him that, and he sent them to Bethlehem. But here's the part that I really want us to focus on and understand tonight, is that they gave 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And when we think about these 3 different gifts, you think of all of the things in the world today, or you go back 2,000 years ago and think of all of the things that kings from the east could come and bring to Jesus Christ. Why did they bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh? Why them 3 items? And as you begin to think about it and you look at the life of Jesus Christ, you find out that these Gentiles were also prophesying something about the Messiah. Because each one of these items had held a significant place in the life of Jesus Christ in his rule and reign. When we think about the gold represents his kingship. Jesus was the promised Messiah, but he was also promised to be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He said, "We come looking for the King of the Jews that was born." And so the gold recognized, in order to be a king, you have to have gold. You have to have money to run your kingdom and to be able to do these things. And so that gold also provided Mary and Joseph with some material support, because what's fixing to happen? In verse 12, you read that the angel comes and tells Joseph and Mary to get the child and head to Egypt. And so all of a sudden, they've got to grab up roots and they've got to leave to go to Egypt because of the persecution and Herod wanting to kill all of the young children. And so gold is the kingship. And then he mentions the next one, the frankincense. Frankincense deals with the priesthood. Not only was Jesus Christ come as a king, but he also came as a priest. The priests were the mediators between God and man and God. And if you remember, on the night of his crucifixion, when he was in trial before his crucifixion, the high priest at that time was Caiaphas. And Caiaphas was in his high priest wardrobe. Why? The only time they wore that high priest wardrobe was on the day before the offering of the Passover. And so he's there, and what does it say? When Jesus Christ says, I am the Christ, he immediately rips his robe and tears it and says, blasphemy. And the significance of that is the Hebrews tells us that Jesus Christ wore the robe of righteousness. Jesus Christ took up that priestly robe. And so therefore we no longer have to go to a priest, we go through Jesus Christ. Well, frankincense was a fragrant that was used in the incense of the temple worship. When they went into, you remember if you go into the outer court, that's where the sacrifices was made. The basin was there. You go into the holy place, and in the holy place there was the candelabra, there was the altar of incense, and there was the table of showbread. And it was on that altar of incense that they would put frankincense. And what that frankincense represented was, as that fragrance went up, it went up to God, and it represented their prayers, and that God heard them, and that their life and their sacrifices was a sweet fragrance unto God as they worshiped and they sacrificed these different things. And so when you look at the life of Jesus Christ, he became sin for us who knew no sin. He didn't make a sacrifice for us. He is the sacrifice. And so they gave him the gold because he was a king. They gave him frankincense because he was the high priest. But then they gave him myrrh. In order to fulfill and to become the king, and in order to become the high priest, he had to die. And myrrh was a part of one of the herbs that they used in the burial. They would take and they would put myrrh on there. It was a spice that helped with the embalming process. And so what they were also doing was giving him the myrrh that would be used later on his body at his burial, which is significant of that. And so when we look at these different gifts, we also think about and when we talk about that myrrh, if you also remember that they offered up, it talks about that bitter cup that Jesus Christ said, I would have to drink. They gave him gall mixed with vinegar and myrrh as they there on the cross of Calvary. And so it all pointed to his death that was there. And so these gifts weren't random. They wasn't just 3 items, these Gentiles. They had obviously done their research. They obviously knew what was to be expected and what he was coming to do. And so they acknowledged his identity and his mission, that he was coming to be king, that he was coming to be priest, but that he was also coming to die. And that's what the priest and the king didn't understand. And that's what troubled them. And that's what got them so upset, because what? If this is really him, our jobs are no longer. Our position, our power, our prestige is no longer if this is the Messiah. And so it causes us, as we look at this simple story and telling here in the Bible, it points us to making a very drastic decision. Are we willing to give up our life and our ambition so that Jesus Christ can do what Christ is called to do? Or are we fighting with Christ constantly, keeping him from doing what he was supposed to do? And, you can either be the wise men who came promoting him as king and priest, or you can be like Herod and the scribes and the Pharisees and be troubled and be mad and try to change it. But the truth is guess what? Jesus Christ rules and reigns. And when he was born to be king and to be a priest. And we have to accept him that as both in order to be for salvation to work. And so just in that clear Christmas story, and I haven't done Matthew chapter 2 because it's more really about the wise men than it is about Jesus Christ. But when you start looking at the different things, then that brings it back to Jesus Christ. And that's what Christmas is all about. But just know that the wise men probably, according to Scripture, didn't show up there at the stable, but they actually showed up sometime later. Tradition has, and reading the different things, is that Joseph and Mary actually returned back to Nazareth. But they didn't stay there very long, that they actually picked up and they moved back to Bethlehem because that was where his family was. That's where his roots was. If you remember in Luke chapter 2, it says that he had to go back to Bethlehem because that's where his family and lineage to pay his taxes. And so tradition says is that they actually moved back to Bethlehem for a short time. And then that's where the wise men came back. There's others that believe that they actually came to him in Nazareth. And I don't know. The scripture says that Herod sent them to Bethlehem. So I seem to think that he was in Bethlehem. So the tradition seems to fit more than the idea that they went to Nazareth after Herod and the star sent them to Bethlehem. So anyway, any questions or comments? Don't forget Sunday, a couple of announcements and housekeeping before we start choir. Sunday is the cantata that morning. If you know people that are not in church, that are not doing anything, invite them to come to our cantata. The cantata this year is wonderful. Not that the other ones hadn't been good, but this one's good. It's going to be really good. And so come and be a part of that. Sunday night at 6 o'clock, we will have our candlelight service. And so come and invite people to come to that. Be a part of that. And then, of course, we won't have any services during the week. And then we'll meet back the next Sunday.